Welcome back to another backstabbing and partner zapping episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that regularly enters the world of survival horror. This week, for no reason in particular at all, we'll be revisiting the fateful night that the Star's Bravo team were sent to investigate a series of grisly murders in and around the Arklay Mountains. This mission, as you'd expect, was very long and filled with various forms of terror, which is not dissimilar to its development, which went through several abandoned forms, a switch to a completely different console generation, and ultimately to a fairly muted response from both fans and critics. So grab your ink ribbons, magnums, and yellow, red, green herb mixes as I answer the question, what happened to
Resident Evil 0?
As we discussed not too long ago, Nintendo burned quite a few bridges with third parties when they designed their first 3D-capable console. But unlike Squaresoft, Capcom still wanted to keep the big N within arm's reach, in case their 64-bit gamble proved successful. So once work was finally completed on the PlayStation version of Resident Evil 2, which was its own arduous thing, and became Capcom's biggest seller at that point, they re-examine the possibility of supporting Nintendo once again. The timing actually worked out pretty well, because throughout 1998, the N64 had hit its sales stride, moving 9.5 million consoles, which must have been an encouraging number to Capcom. However, when Nintendo revealed that their upcoming and totally worthwhile 64DD add-on would have a very robust 64 megabytes of additional storage capacity, it was decided that a completely original chapter in the Resident Evil saga would be a good fit for it. Koji Oda, the system planner on the first RE, was assigned the role of director, with Noboru Sugimura, who had proved invaluable at reshaping the storyline of RE2, saddled with story duties once more. So they had a pretty good team lined up already, but like we've learned with almost all Resident Evil games, despite all the pieces being in place, the start of development is often quite temperamental. And that holds very true for Resident Evil 0, because in its earliest incarnation, it wasn't even focused on the special tactics and rescue service at all, but instead two young civilians who obviously loved their punk culture, which was the style at the time. The female character was named Annie, while the boy was named Billy, with the latter being one of the very few things that would remain a constant throughout development. Simply put, this was going to be a side story, telling the tale of two random Raccoon City civilians getting caught up in the Umbrella Corporation's endless and very evil pursuit of the capitalist dream. However, things started to pivot from this direction fairly quickly, and not much work was done on this version before it was suggested by Sugimura that a full-on prequel focused on the Star's Bravo team was the safer bet. This move made sense, as it was already established that there had been a huge chunk of time after Bravo team was initially dispatched that hadn't been explored yet, and since the team had surviving male and female operatives already, it would fit nicely with the series tradition. So Annie was dropped in favor of Rebecca Chambers, but strangely, instead of using, say, Richard Aiken or Enrico Marini, the previous concept of an abrasive punk-style character was retained, as I assume the team felt it would make for a better contrast. I mean, hey, look at them! They're the original odd couple! But Billy would go through his own transformation, morphing from bleached blonde punk to escaped convict to the tribal tattooed bad boy we all know and love today. Unfortunately, character makeovers were the least of Capcom's problems, because while the concepting phase of RE0 was going well, the logistical and programming portions were not. No matter how Capcom tried to accommodate for the N64's architecture and the 64DD's added storage space, they still had doubts they could squeeze in the franchise's signature rendered backgrounds, CGI cutscenes, and voiceovers. Doubts that, in the end, proved to be 100% true. As the programmers worked away at navigating around the limited storage capacity of the Nintendo 64, the design team were implementing several concepts that, for various reasons, wound up being cut. Albert Wesker was originally planned to have a constant presence throughout the game, assassinating various Bravo team members along the way via his own rat-like BOW creature, a creature that, funnily enough, would be resurrected later on. Wesker's in-game presence was reconsidered when the team realized that since his intentions were already made very public in RE1, it wouldn't exactly make for good drama the second time around. Thus, Wesker was pushed more into the background and partnered up with William Birkin, while the main in-game threat turned into James Marcus and his wonderful Technicolor dreamcoat of slithering leeches. This is where the Wesker monster concept was repurposed, as Marcus would now utilize his slimy minions to constantly halt Rebecca and Billy's progress. By the start of 1999, all the concepts had been finalized, so work began in earnest over the next few months. But while the team were placing their hopes and dreams on that extra and very crucial 64 megabytes afforded by the DD, those hopes would come crashing down. When the long-delayed peripheral released in Japan for sale in December of 1999, it was, well, a catastrophic flop, selling only 15,000 units in total, with its exact launch numbers being even worse. These metrics weren't the type of ones Capcom were willing to hedge their bets on, as releasing a mainline Resident Evil game for a peripheral nobody wanted to own was obviously bad for business. So for a while, the team pivoted back to developing RE0 for the base N64, which, as it so happened, made for another case of good timing. By mid-1999, thick, girthy, turgid 64 megabyte carts were made standard by Nintendo, which is how the in-development port of RE2 was even made possible in the first place. However, that project had the added advantage of a studio, in this case of the Angel variety, that had a ton of experience working on the N64 already, along with Factor 5's proprietary compression technology, something Capcom's Japanese team didn't have time to come to grips with. So they found themselves in an awkward position that was getting increasingly difficult to crawl out from, trying to design a game for hardware that was becoming very incompatible with their vision, but still, they plugged away for a few months more. During this time, they were even attempting things that the series would only achieve almost a decade later, with one springing forth from the sole advantage of N64 cartridges, which was of course instant loading. It's here where the zapping system of RE2 was adapted to let the player freely swap between Rebecca and Billy, but the team also wanted to push this even further, allowing two players to simultaneously control them both, which of course made the duo even more formidable. But to compensate for this increased power of co-op, the team experimented with allowing zombies to run and take more damage. Like, that's just crazy to me, and it should be to you too, that both powerful running zombies and true two-player co-op were first attempted back in 1999, before the concept was used much later on. But of course, due to all the technical headaches and problems the team were already facing, such a feature was eventually dropped, as the team needed to focus on what they could deliver rather than what they hoped to. When RE0 was first shown to the media via screenshots and video, it garnered positive first impressions, especially in magazines, but this simply wasn't enough to convince Capcom higher-ups that continuing to struggle on the base N64 was worth it, especially since the console's sales started to nosedive in 2000, and so the project was cancelled. But was it really cancelled? Yes, it was. Or was it? Because unbeknownst to most of the public, Capcom and Nintendo had been canoodling in the background, and they were about to announce something that would turn the world of survival horror on its head. I'm referring, of course, to the Capcom 5, and more specifically, Shinji Mikami's pledge to make Resident Evil a GameCube exclusive. I got my hands quite deep into the zombie viscera on that particular subject in my Resi 4 video, and again in my Flophouse Files episode, so please refer to those when time permits. What's important to this story, though, is that once again, RE0 avoided full cancellation simply because of good timing, as Nintendo was all about moving ambitious late-gen N64 projects over to the GameCube, something that certainly pleased Capcom's engineers, who were sick of constantly fighting for every byte of storage space. Of course, the GameCube mini discs still could not hold the same amount of data as a PS2 DVD, but that at least could be mitigated by shipping on 2 discs. But the struggles weren't over just yet, because as Shinji Mikami's newly designated Production Studio 4 was going full steam ahead on their RE1 remake, the changes they were bringing to the franchise would have a knock-on effect on Production Studio 3's Resident Evil 0, which would only complicate things even more. Aside from the story, design, and concept work, basically everything the team had made for RE0 on the N64 had to be thrown in the bin and remade with the same visual fidelity that Mikami and his team were achieving on the GameCube. One of these smaller snags revolved around altering Rebecca's default design, as evidenced by her original beret and shoulder pads, which were meant to mimic Jill Valentine's attire. Fan theories have posited that during her adventure, Rebecca would lose those particular articles of clothing through various instances of battle damage, and be gifted her red bandana by Billy by the end of the game. This was obviously all changed when Rebecca was redesigned in the RE1 remake, and to maintain further visual consistency, Production Studio 4 shared Rebecca's model with the RE0 team, saving a little bit of time, which is something I would be saying to you if it wasn't for one big biff. Since they can take weeks and sometimes months from concept to final render, some CGI cutscenes had already been finished with Rebecca's old design, which meant those needed to be scrapped when the switch was made. To smooth over some of these inconsistencies, especially when it came to the story, Sugimura was brought back to rewrite some sections, although he admitted in a later interview that he had forgotten a lot of what he had done on the N64 version years prior, so he had to play a little bit of catch-up with the material. In fact, it seemed the entire team were always playing catch-up, something that was exacerbated somewhat by Shinji Mikami himself, as he had publicly announced that RE0 was going to ship less than a year after the RE1 remake, which did put a certain amount of pressure on Production Studio 3. So while the team were rushing to meet this deadline, Zero was MIA at several trade shows and events throughout late 2000 and 2001, which led some in the media to report that the game might have run into production problems at best and had been cancelled at worst. Capcom squashed these rumors fairly quickly by starting to show the GameCube version in early 2002, which to its credit was stunning, especially the sections on board the iconic Ecliptic Express. In reality, though, the game had run into some technical issues. Chief among these was the switch to disc-based media. The entire concept of RE0 relied on instant loading for the new partner zapping system, and even though the GameCube could read its mini-discs quite quickly, there was still a hurdle to clear here. It took some time, but this was eventually solved by the team making it so that an identical version of whatever room Billy and Rebecca were in was stored in the GameCube's RAM temporarily, so that when the player decided to swap, it was able to do so with minimal fuss. Now, while it was not as instantaneous as it had been on the N64, it was still a pretty impressive technical workaround. The other element that was carried over from the prior version was the ability to drop items at any time to help manage space, but this decision came with one big asterisk. Originally, the N64 version had contained regular item boxes as well, but that plan was eventually revised as the team felt they wanted the game to be more challenging and also work as an additional homage to the NES Chiller and RE's spiritual predecessor, Sweet Home, as well as give Zero another unique feature over the remake. Well, it sure did make things more challenging, but to many players and members of the press, more tedious, because instead of retrieving all your spare ammo or herbs from several pre-designated points around the map, in RE0, oftentimes you'd find yourself having to manually trudge to the extreme opposite end of the training facility and through this room of eliminators. Oh god, I almost forgot. Remember the Wesker monster? Well, that concept was revisited one more time because those rat-faced bastards were repurposed into brutally tough simians, becoming one of Resident Evil's most hated BOWs. So after a lot of work throughout 2001 and following a good showing at E3 2002, RE0 lurched onto store shelves in November of that year, and it received mostly solid reviews from critics, though many cited that the series' tropes, tank controls, ink ribbons, and item management were getting long in the tooth when compared to Capcom's own Devil May Cry, Onimusha, or even other survival horror games on the GameCube, like Eternal Darkness. Another problem was that RE0 was often pointed at as an example of oversaturation, as the remake had released just a few months earlier, with both looking and playing largely the same. So because of all these factors, RE0 sold well under Capcom's own expectations, although those did top out at a respectable 1.2 million copies. But still, it was this retail performance that sort of forced Shinji Mikami and Production Studio 4 to want to shake up the Resident Evil formula, which, as we know, they absolutely did. As for RE0 itself, well, it was re-released a number of times, including the bare-bones Wii port, being remade within the on-rails restrictions of the Umbrella Chronicles, and finally the 2016 HD remaster that was actually supervised by some of the original team, such as former director Koji Oda. This version added a lot of new content like extra costumes and even a completely unique edition, Wesker Mode, where you controlled old Albie himself. This version, which I'm sure was a relief to the members of the dev team, actually went on to be a bigger sales success, moving over 2.8 million copies as of 2020, with the game's final worldwide total of all versions sitting at about 5.3 million. Not bad considering it was once perceived as a sales flop. That's not all though. Since Capcom has been seeing unprecedented sales success with remakes of their Resident Evil back catalog, the rumor mill has never stopped the churning with theories about what will be next. It was, however, only recently when Dusk Golem, a notable RE leaker, claimed that a remake of Rebecca and Billy's Wild Ride, as well as Code Veronica, were indeed currently in development, something that got even more credence this past October when further evidence was uncovered that would support the claim. It was noticed that Far Cry 5 and Guardians of the Galaxy voice actor John McLaren had updated their resume, which has now been made private, with a new AAA game listed as Project Chamber, which he had worked on with Beyond Capture Studios, the exact same performance capturing company utilized by Capcom on both the RE4 remake and Street Fighter 6. It therefore doesn't take a lot to imagine he might indeed be playing Billy Cohen, which, if true, will give Resident Evil 0 another chance at showing its full potential. The unique, creepy atmosphere of the Ecliptic Express, the slimy slitherings of the leeches, and the unbridled frustration of fighting the Eliminator. Actually, scratch that last one. We don't need it. But if you know of any other shattered survival horrors that went through hell and back during their development, scribble them on a bloodstained note in the comments below, or shout them out over on the runaway train that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!